What just happened between Canada and Donald Trump isn't a story of rhetoric. It's a story of calculation, resilience, and structural strategy. When Canada said no, loudly, publicly, and directly, it wasn't defiance for the sake of defiance. It was the culmination of an almost 18-month campaign in which every possible avenue of pressure was applied, and then countered with deliberate strategy. Understanding this moment requires unpacking both the demands made by the White House and the responses orchestrated by Mark Carney. Let's start with the context, because the backdrop of January 2025 is critical. The moment Trump returned to the Oval Office, he wasted no time targeting Canada with economic force. Using the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, he declared a national emergency. Not for a war, not for a natural disaster, but because of Canada. Tariffs immediately spiked to 25% on most goods and 10% on energy. The administration framed this as a public health and security measure, claiming Canadian pipelines were conduits for fentanyl. Here's the problem. The data did not support it. U.S. Customs and Border Protection statistics show that only 0.2% of fentanyl entering the U.S. came via the northern border. The rest, nearly 99.8%, came from the south. Yet the tariffs were imposed anyway. That's the first moment to internalize. Compliance and data didn't matter. Washington's demands weren't rationally linked to the stated issue. They were leveraged. By March 4, 2025, the 25% tariffs were in full force. By August, they were raised to 35% via executive order. The signal was consistent. Concessions alone wouldn't guarantee safety. Every action Canada took, from border security to compliance reporting, didn't influence escalation. That's when Carney realized the nature of the challenge. This was not a negotiation. It was an ultimatum. Every concession without reciprocity would only invite the next demand. To protect Canada, he had to redefine the game. Instead of reacting emotionally or symbolically, Carney applied a cold, analytical, structural approach. Exactly the mindset honed during his time leading both the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England. Let's walk through the 5 demands Washington put forward and why Canada's refusal was both necessary and calculated. Demand 1. Secure the border and crack down on fentanyl. Canada responded almost immediately, deploying a $1.3 billion border security initiative, establishing specialized enforcement agencies, and designating criminal organizations as terrorist entities. Yet the tariffs remained. The lesson: compliance alone does not buy safety. Demand 2. Address the trade deficit with the United States. This is where Trump's logic faltered. He equated a trade deficit with economic weakness, ignoring the integrated nature of the North American supply chain. A single automobile part can cross the US-Canada border 7 or 8 times before assembly. Tariffs don't fix deficits. They disrupt production and hurt both sides. Carney didn't reject this demand blindly. Instead, he initiated negotiations for a new bilateral framework that protected Canada's core interests and simultaneously launched a trade diversification push across 4 continents. Over 6 months, 12 deals were signed, laying the groundwork for long-term resilience beyond reliance on a single partner. Demand 3. Join the United States Board of Peace. On the surface, it sounded benign, but it represented an attempt to bind Canada under US-controlled international oversight, essentially challenging sovereignty. Carney's response was public and principled. At the World Economic Forum in Davos, he warned about the weaponization of economic integration, tariffs, and financial networks without naming Trump directly. The response from Washington was immediate. Trump canceled Canada's invitation. Carney's counter? A calm, deliberate reaffirmation of principle. Canada would not be coerced. Demand 4. Do not pursue trade with China. Canada's diversification strategy was rational. The U.S. was increasingly unpredictable, so hedging risk with a modest, limited trade arrangement with China was sensible. Trump interpreted it as capitulation. He threatened 100% tariffs, but Carney was precise. The arrangement was limited, transparent, and consistent with USMCA commitments. He communicated directly to the White House, emphasizing that this was risk management, not surrender. Demand 5. become the 51st state. This was perhaps the most audacious demand. Trump repeatedly suggested Canada should surrender sovereignty and merge with the US, posting altered maps, digital content, and public messaging that framed annexation as an inevitable outcome. Carney's response in the Oval Office was clear and unyielding. As you know from real estate, some places are never for sale. We are sitting in one right now. His gestures, silent, deliberate, communicated one thing: Canada would not bend, now or ever. While maintaining this political and diplomatic posture, Carney simultaneously engineered structural resilience at home. A $6 billion resilience package targeted employment support, business liquidity, and retraining programs. $418 million flowed immediately to displaced workers, separation rules were relaxed, and $424 million further aided those affected by tariff shocks. A $10 billion loan facility supported large employers, while $450 million went into workforce development programs designed to move tens of thousands of workers into sectors insulated from U.S. economic coercion. This wasn't symbolic spending. It was structural security. Carney understood that sovereignty and resilience required building an economy capable of absorbing shocks, not one passively hoping tariffs might be lifted. The genius of the strategy is paradoxical. Canada made peripheral concessions, such as dropping its digital services tax on major U.S. tech companies and increasing military spending. Carney allowed Washington certain wins that had minimal impact on Canada's structural integrity. By absorbing these low-stakes costs, Canada preserved the core pillars: sovereignty, USMCA rights, diversification, and refusal of annexation. It is an example of absorptive diplomacy. Sacrifice what you can afford to save what you cannot. The broader geopolitical implications are profound. Canada has signaled to middle powers globally that integration and interdependence can be leveraged to protect national sovereignty, even against an unpredictable superpower. A carefully constructed blend of restraint, economic intelligence, and domestic political maneuvering demonstrates that strategic patience, rather than reactionary escalation, can shift the balance. Domestically, the approach has strengthened Carney's political capital. Trump's threats of annexation generated a wave of Canadian nationalism that reinvigorated his political base, reversed polling trends, and helped maintain public support for decisive leadership. But this nationalism has limits. If Canada appears to absorb threats without meaningful counteraction, public confidence may erode. The recent U.S. House vote to terminate Trump's National Emergency Authority, 219-211, illustrates fractures in Washington that further enhance Canada's leverage. 6 Republicans defied threats to vote against the president's tariff authority, signaling potential cracks in U.S. political support for coercive trade measures. Economically, the cost of the trade war is asymmetric. The tariffs imposed by the U.S. in 2025 represent the largest per-household average tax increase since 1993. Roughly $1,000 per American household, with projections to rise in 2026. U.S. consumers, workers, and businesses are absorbing the costs. Carney's strategy leverages this asymmetry. Canada suffers targeted shocks while maximizing U.S. exposure to politically sensitive costs. Patience, not retaliation, becomes the primary weapon. The upcoming USMCA renegotiation is the crucible moment. If Carney can hold Canada's core lines, sovereignty, industrial integrity, diversification, while engaging in a fair and balanced renegotiation, the concessions made, the resilience measures deployed, and the Davos speech will collectively appear as a masterclass in strategic defense. If not, Canada may be compelled to build a fully independent economic architecture, less integrated with the U.S. but structurally insulated from coercion. One thing is clear: the assumptions that guided North American trade pre-2025, incremental cooperation, predictable policy, good faith engagement, no longer hold. Tariffs, threats, and unilateral executive action have ruptured the status quo. Canada's answer has been clear: negotiation, not capitulation; absorption, not compliance; structural integrity, not superficial concession. Carney's strategy combines diplomacy, economics, domestic politics, and foresight. It shows that a middle power can enforce its interests without escalating to open conflict. And critically, it redefines leverage. Sovereignty now depends on the ability to withstand coercion, while simultaneously building alternative economic pathways. From Trump's perspective, this confrontation exposed limits in both perception and execution. The Oval Office confrontation, 5 public refusals, illustrates that even a president with maximal executive authority can be constrained by systemic interdependencies, political realities, and economic logic. When the most powerful person in the world encounters a counterpart who prioritizes structural resilience and calculative patience over symbolic submission, the rules of engagement fundamentally change. The lessons extend beyond Canada-US relations. Middle powers globally are observing this demonstration of strategic leverage through structural integration. States facing coercive measures from larger powers can emulate elements, diversify trade, build domestic shock absorbers, and engage foreign stakeholders who wield influence over key decision-makers. Ultimately, the question is whether Canada can continue holding these lines in the face of escalating pressure, or whether the accumulated costs will force concessions. If Carney's calculated approach succeeds, it will mark a paradigm shift in how smaller powers interact with superpowers. If it fails, the outcome may accelerate the development of an independent, resilient Canadian economy, but at a high cost. The narrative is not yet complete, but the 2025 episode establishes a precedent. Sovereignty, strategic patience, and structural resilience can offset coercive power, but only when executed with precision, clarity of objective, and the willingness to absorb short-term shocks for long-term stability. Canada has said no 5 times over, not quietly, not diplomatically, loudly, publicly, and with intent. Each refusal reflects a principle. Sovereignty is not negotiable. Structural resilience is essential. Strategic patience is power. And as the world watches, one thing is clear. The rules of engagement have changed. The assumptions that once underpinned North American trade and sovereignty have been challenged, disrupted, and redefined by the events of 2025. What was once considered stable, predictable, and routine is now subject to scrutiny and recalibration. The reverberations of these actions will not fade quickly. They will shape policy decisions, economic strategies, and diplomatic approaches for the next decade. Governments, corporations, and markets alike are forced to recognize that old models may no longer apply. The ultimate outcome remains uncertain. No one can say for certain how the next wave of negotiations, alliances, or disputes will play out. Yet one thing is undeniable. The blueprint for defending national interest against coercion has never been clearer. The lessons from recent crises demonstrate that preparation, discipline, and a clear-eyed assessment of leverage can allow a nation to withstand pressure without sacrificing core principles. The ability to anticipate moves, to structure responses methodically, and to remain steady under external pressure has emerged as a central skill in global strategy. This is not simply a story about tariffs, trade disputes, or economic numbers. It is about something larger, a new paradigm of national strategy in the 21st century. In this era, middle powers are no longer limited to reactive measures or defensive postures. With foresight, institutional discipline, and the careful orchestration of policy, they can engage even the world's most powerful nations on their own terms. The old assumption that strength is measured purely by size or wealth has been challenged. Strategic intelligence, credibility, and consistency have proven equally powerful. Mark Carney's leadership exemplifies this transformation. Through measured action and steady communication, he has not only defended Canada's interests, but also sent a message to the global community. It is possible to act firmly, decisively, and without yielding core values, even in the face of coercive pressures. Carney's approach demonstrates that restraint does not equate to weakness, and discipline can be more effective than bluster or impulsive retaliation. In doing so, he has taught a lesson that extends far beyond any single nation: the importance of strategy rooted in structure, foresight, and patience. The implications extend across multiple domains. Economically, investors now view policy stability as a critical factor in allocating capital. Diplomatically, nations are reassessing the balance between coercion and negotiation. Politically, governments are learning that credibility and predictability can be as decisive as military or economic might. The events of 2025 have crystallized a new understanding. In a world of rapid change and constant disruption, measured and principled action can set the standard for global engagement. In many ways, this is a defining moment for how mid-sized powers operate on the world stage. The lessons are clear: anticipate, structure, and communicate. Avoid reactionary moves. Maintain consistency. These principles, exemplified through Carney's actions, provide a roadmap for nations seeking to protect sovereignty and national interest without resorting to escalation or surrender. The story of 2025 is therefore more than a historical account. It is a guide for the next generation of policymakers, diplomats, and strategists. Ultimately, this is about the evolution of strategy itself. It is a demonstration that power is not only measured in resources or force, but also in the ability to act decisively, calmly, and effectively. The world has taken note, and the rules of engagement have shifted. As nations adjust to this new reality, the lessons learned will resonate far beyond North America, shaping the practice of statecraft for years to come. The question for analysts, policymakers, and global leaders is this: do they internalize the lesson, or do they repeat the mistakes that nearly forced Canada to the negotiating table under duress? Because the calculus of 2025 isn't hypothetical, it's the new baseline.